Kevin, you want to teach us quickly?
Yeah. Okay. So I'm just looking at something here. Going back to continue with what I discussed yesterday, is a character trait that's in life of stubbornness, which Pharaoh, even though his heart was hardened and didn't let the Jewish people go, he was it reflects his stubbornness and inflexibility. And if people are not, if they're stubborn and they dig their heels in, it's difficult to have relationships with people and to be flexible in life. And I mean, I'm talking to myself here, especially with regards to relationships and if you employ people and particularly as in relationships, because you can't. One needs to. Sometimes we're not always right, and we need to listen to what the other side says. And if we're stubborn and inflexible, like I know some people who everything that everyone else does is wrong and they're right. And I know a guy that gets upset at the smallest little thing. The smallest little thing upsets him. He's a great. You guys don't know who he is. A very, very good guy. And I've told him just to chill out and not. It's not worth it. Things don't always go our way, and we need to be flexible with decisions and our outlook in order to maintain healthy relationships.
Yeah, I agree. It's a good lesson if we learn
Otherwise,
this.
they'll never work.
Exactly.
For all of us, yeah.
I'll tell you something, the ability to compromise and just to not get upset.
Yeah.
That's
It's not
everything.
easy.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, and especially if one's built with a predisposition for either perfection or, that's tough character traits to work on. What we're going to do today, by the way, is yesterday we learned that Rabbi Meir, there was evidence for the fact that he holds that change affects acquisition, and that the penalty that's imposed is a penalty that can override his general principle that a physical change affects acquisition for the robber. And when does he apply that penalty? Is at best to suit the original owner. So in a case of depreciation, who would that suit? That physical change affects acquisition, it would suit the robber. So in that particular case, is the robber can't return the animal to the original owner and say that change has affected acquisition. He gets to keep it because of the principle of the physical change affecting acquisition, but it would work out badly for the original owner when it comes to appreciation, because the robber gets to keep the profit of the proceeds of the byproduct, at which case that the change affects acquisition for the robber means the robber makes a profit from the difference between a fetus to a calf, and Rabbi Meir is not going to have that. So again, Rabbi Meir, bottom line is that we've proved that change does affect acquisition, but the penalty that can override it and make a change not affect acquisition is when it's to the detriment of the original owner. So that can be installed and uninstalled or applied or left out, according to Rabbi Meir, but that a change does affect acquisition. Are we all clear with that before I go on?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, pretty straightforward. Now, the Gemara is actually going to bring the argument in a slightly different version of the previous discussion. So when the Gemara does something like this, you will say, well, why just tell it in another way? Like, why not just have one way to tell it? Because often when the Gemara brings the same answer in a different way. We're learning different lessons from that answer. And it's in that purpose that we bring a different version of the events about. But the conclusion will be the same, is that change effects acquisition for Rabbi Meir, but the penalty that's imposed is only against a thief that has done so by breaking the law, and not because he was an inadvertent or negligent thief by not listening to instructions properly. It's a form of robbery, that, but it certainly wasn't done with malice, and it can be remedied. But as far as that's concerned, he's more lenient on that sort of inverted commas robber, because the intention wasn't to break the law, he just should have listened better. So that's why in the case of the haberdashery shop, the dyer that misheard the sort of dyed wool to be effected, means that he did spend money on the dye, and he spent money on labor getting it to the color. It happened to be the wrong color. So the original owner is not entitled to make a profit. He's also not entitled to a loss of his raw wool. So he gets the money back for his raw wool. But the person that's dyeing it wasn't a purposeful robber, he just was wrong. And therefore he gets to keep the changed wool color, because he's more likely to sell it for a profit, as he's already put in labor and time and dyeing costs. And the original owner gets restored to his previous point of the raw wool value through payment restitution. So right, the Gemara presents a different version of the previous discussion. There are those who say that this matter of whether Rabbi Meir holds that change effects acquisition was actually never a question to us. For since Rav reverses the opinion cited in the Mishnah regarding the stolen animal and slaves that aged, and it teaches the Mishnah as follows. Okay? So what we are saying is, if one stole an animal and it aged, slaves and they aged, he pays their value at the time of the robbery. These are the words of Rabbi Meir. So guys, clearly you can see Rabbi Meir says that a change there, it seems there as if a change does affect acquisition, and a detrimental loss means that it's the thief's to bear, and he has to replace the value at the time of the robbery. But the sages are the ones that say, in this particular version, in the case of slaves, the robber may say to the original owner, behold, what is yours is before you. Because they say that maybe slaves are the equivalent of land and not movables. This is again a different version of the preceding discussion. But it's certainly clear that according to Rabbi Meir, change does generally affect acquisition. And here in the Brisa, where it states that a robber must return the offspring in the shorn wool, it's actually a penalty that Rabbi Meir imposes. So, when we inquire about Rabbi Meir's opinion, this is what we inquired. When Rabbi Meir imposes the penalty so that the robber does not profit from his acquisition through change, it's only guys where he acted deliberately, in other words, with intent to steal. But we learned that where he acted inadvertently, so for example, the he was, let me just give you an example, not from the haberdashery. Let me just give you a separate example. You've got somebody that buys wool-laden ewe, okay? Or he buys a pregnant cow. But he was not aware that it was stolen and that it's being sold to him by the robber. So in that particular case, that was a certain degree of negligence as well. But it certainly wasn't a proper robbery necessarily. Okay, so, but where he acted inadvertently, Rabbi Meir doesn't pose a penalty. So the question arises is, maybe it's saying in the Gemara at this point, perhaps even where he acted inadvertently, Rabbi Meir also imposes the penalty. Okay, so we didn't have a doubt that change affects acquisition according to this version of events. The doubt is whether the penalty is applied across the board, whether or not the robber acts inadvertently, or whether it's a criminal robber with ill intent. Do you see the difference, guys? There's no issue about a change effects acquisition. We just want to know, is that penalty across the board, whether it was a purposeful mistake or maybe he bought an item that was stolen and didn't check properly, which is also not great, but it's not as if he made the robbery himself. And obviously the haberdashery shop dyer would deal with the same issue. So it says, all right, let's get a resolution to see whether that penalty is imposed across the board or just in a case of intent to steal, deliberate. Time loan restitution from the following brisa. 5 creditors collect only from unsold properties. Now, what do we mean? Is that we learned this before, guys, is that you can collect, say somebody, Shimon borrows money from Levi, and Shimon decides that in order to borrow money from Levi, he'd love to do it without collateral, but Levi's having none of this because Levi's not sure if Shimon's a degenerate gambler. So what Levi has done is he has a lien on Shimon's properties that if Shimon in the interim gets into debt and sells those properties, Levi is able to claim it back from the buyer. So that's what you call a guaranteed loan that is entitled to attach the asset irrespective of whether the debtor has sold off the asset in the interim before the creditor is able to collect. Does that make sense, guys? So in that case, standard position, whenever there's a lien on a property, you can collect it from unsold properties or sold properties, meaning that the debtor has sold it to another buyer to make money to help his gambling habit. But there are cases where we learn that somebody could lend the money without securing that sort of property with a guarantee, which means obviously if there's unsold property by the debtor, he still has to make good according to the court in paying the creditor. But the difference between having a lien on the property and having no guaranteed lien is that lien affects for the creditor a power that supersedes just collecting it from the debtor. It means he can collect that debt from the buyer to whom the debtor sold the property to, even sold properties. So we are talking here about 5 cases of creditors that you can only collect from unsold property. Now, we're going to see where this is from. The first one is from Bava Kamma in the 14th daf in B, that the Mishnah refers to a buyer of stolen land that was later repossessed by its owner. So in that case, the buyer can demand restitution from the seller for the improvements he made to the land. Okay? I've got trucks coming past this road all the time. It's driving me bonkers. Bonkers.
We can't hear anything, Damon.
Can you not hear?
But neither
Good
can
pun
he.
there, Damon, actually. You said a pun without it, inadvertently.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, no, but we don't hear any background noise, only you.
Okay, now I hear it. Believe me. Maybe it's just the screams in my head. So, all right. So, let's look at the overall principle. In Gittin, Gemara Gittin 48b, we teach we do not collect for consumption of produce or for his improvement of land from sold properties because of the common good. So what do we mean because of the common good? So in this 14th daf of Bava Kamma, it explains that the Mishnah refers to a buyer of stolen land that was later repossessed by the owner. Okay, so the buyer can turn around and demand restitution from the seller. Why? Because it was stolen. Because the original owner now is coming to collect his land from the robber. The robber says, well, I sold it. Now the person that bought it in good faith is going to lose the property. But he's got a claim against the seller who happened to be a thief. Okay, so he can demand the improvements he made to the land as well. In other words, fertilizing it, plowing it. Because when his produce was seized by the owner, in addition to the money he actually paid for the land, there was money that he paid and forked out for the improvements. But since it was the seller who sold the stolen land, he guaranteed the sale. So a lien was created on his property, and the buyer can collect money paid for the land, even if the properties of the seller were subsequently sold to somebody else. But with respect to the loss of produce or his improvements in the field, the buyer can't collect from sold properties, but only from properties still owned by the seller. So why? Because, guys, there has to be a distinction between the value of the improvements and the actual land itself. Why? Because if you improve a land and it starts to give off produce, any prospective buyer of the seller's own property wouldn't know how much of his purchase was at risk at being collected to satisfy an earlier debt. So the sages enacted that you've got these two open-ended items, and they can only be collected from unsold property. Okay? So I'm going to explain what this means. So the first thing of it is there are those who have a claim of produce and the improvement of produce. Okay? In other words, they bought land and there was an improvement and it yielded produce. And then there's another category of one who accepts upon himself to sustain the son or daughter of his wife. So what happened is he got married a second time, and he agrees to support her children from a previous marriage. So since the debt isn't written and it's not a fixed amount, any prospective buyer of the husband's property wouldn't know how much of his purchase was at risk of being collected. Okay, so at the end of the day, it can't be collected from property sold by the husband. So what we are saying is here, if the husband's trying to sell off property, but now he's agreed to help his current wife and her children, then what's going to happen is if there's debts involved and they try and collect his property, then there's the buyer's aware of what the property's worth. But now, if you can collect it from sold property, the buyer is actually going to lose money. Does that make sense? So that's the second category. Now there's a third category. It's if somebody comes to collect a debt with a debt document that does not have a guarantee written within it. In other words, Shimon and Levi, right? Shimon decides to borrow money from Levi, and in this particular case, Levi knows that Shimon isn't a gambler. He just got into hard times, and he wants to help him out. Basically, Shimon's a good guy. He's not a degenerate gambler that would bet on 2 cockroaches even crossing the sidewalk. And in that particular case, what happens with Levi is he said, listen, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll trust you. I will loan you the money without a guarantee in it. There are such people, not many. So then, if that is sold, if Shimon decides to sell that to another person, it's going to be very difficult before Levi because he cannot collect it. The only person he can collect it from is Shimon because there's no lien on the property guaranteeing he can collect it from the buyers. So he can only collect unsold property from Shimon. And there's another category. And if one who collects a woman's ketubah that does not have a guarantee written within it. In other words, it's the same thing. The theme we're trying to see over and over again is debt documents without guarantees. If it has a guarantee and a lien, you can collect it from the person who owes you money directly. Or if he sold that property to a buyer, you can collect it from the buyer because that buyer should have checked if there was a lien on the property. It was the buyer's negligence. So the Gemara said, now whom did you say that he collects the principal from sold property? So what do we mean the principal from sold property? Properties that the robber, guys, had sold after he sold the stolen property to the buyer. So what happens is the guarantee to the buyer contained in the deed of sale has the force of a loan obligation recorded in a loan document, which then, guys, creates a lien on one's properties. So the buyer can collect the principal. In other words, that's what he paid from the stolen property from lands legitimately owned by the robber at the time of the sale, even if those lands have subsequently been sold. So again, you've got a robber, and that robber has become quite wealthy. And what happens is, if a buyer bought land and the robber lied to him and said to him that it's my land, and he said, fine, but then write me a lien guarantee on it. It means that even if that property was sold, even if the original owner comes to the buyer to collect that land, the buyer can then reclaim the value of that land from the robber, from his unsold properties or properties that is in fact sold off. Right. So that's even from sold property. But we're dealing with a different issue here. It says that he collects the improvements he made only from unsold property. So, okay, the property is presently owned by the robber. He can collect the financial improvements that he made to the land in terms of what it cost him to sow seeds and harvest and the produce value. Because although the guarantee stated in the deed covers improvements that the buyer might make, there's actually no lien on the seller's properties for those improvements. It's only on the actual property value it's worth. All right. So, guys, can you give over what I'm saying here?
Kevin?
I can't give it 100%, but when someone wants a lien on a property, it has to be, you said a minute ago, on the actual value. It's got to be determined very accurately, based on, was it based on depreciation or based on the current market value?
No. So you heard me correct. I just need to explain what I'm saying. Is that you've got Shimon and Reuven and Shimon. Okay. So say somebody buys a property from a seller. They don't know if there's something severely wrong with the property. It could be one of two things, Kevin. The property could in fact be stolen, or the property itself could be indebted to somebody else for this guy's a gambling addict. So when you buy a property, if there's a previous lien on that property, but you're buying it and you think that property is clean, then somebody can repossess your property that you paid for. In modern terms, I buy a car. Now that person still owes First National or Westbank or Nedbank the monthly payments on the car. He gives me the title deed and he gives me the car. Now, if I want the car, but I'm stupid enough not to take this title deed, and he says, here are the keys to the car, it's yours. You got it for a steal. He might not be lying when he said you got it for a steal. So what we're saying is here, the first thing after you do in South Africa when you buy a car is you want to see you've got the car registration papers. Now, when you pay the bank every month for your car, they don't give you the original papers so that you can't sell it under their nose. In other words, they withhold the vehicle registration papers until the last payment is made. Otherwise, anybody that got into trouble that's paying off a car for a bank would sell the car if they had the title deed to the car. What do we mean by the title deed? The actual registration papers that got full ownership. Who keeps those papers? It's the bank. So the bank actually owns the car until the last payment is made. But it took us a couple of centuries to work this out. And what happened before is you'd buy an asset and you'd end up being horrified when somebody else came to collect that asset because that asset had not been paid off. That's what we're saying, Kevin. So what happens is, if I'm going to buy a car from you and you've got limited paperwork for whatever reason, or I don't know that you owe money around town. Maybe there's damages that you pay money on. Maybe you're borrowing money. Maybe you're in trouble. So either way, no matter what happens, if you write a legal contract that I've got a lien on that property that I've purchased. What it means is if somebody else comes to confiscate it, I've still got a claim against the person that sold it to me. But that claim goes even further if there's a guarantee. I can not only collect it from the person that sold me the property, I can collect any of his other properties if that property has been repossessed by the original owner. Further to which, if there's a guarantee, Kevin, if and that property was taken away from me, but the person that sold me that property has subsequently sold property to somebody else, I can take that from somebody else, just like they took it from me. But it's all according to a guarantee or a lien on the property or that value. So it pays. You can have an arrangement where there is a lien both on the property and the improvements. In other words, I'll turn around to you and I'll say, look, I bought this land for 200,000 Rand. I'm going to spend another 100,000 Rand on farming equipment and seeds and plowing it to turn this land into produce agricultural land. But in other words, I'm sticking 100,000 of my own money and buying fallow land for 200,000. Now, when somebody goes to take my property back, the original owner, or the property that was sold to me was indebted to the seller, was indebted to the creditor of the seller, then I've got a problem. So now with my contract with the seller, I'm entitled to take it both from his properties or whoever I can that he sold properties to. But I can only take from sold properties the actual 200,000 Rand value of the property, Kevin. What I cannot take is the improvements of 100,000 Rand. I can only take that 100,000 Rand improvement from unsold properties. In other words, the person that sold it to me, if he's got properties in his possession, I'm entitled to take for the loss of improvements when the land that I bought legitimately is confiscated from me. But that I can't take from a third party. And the reason why you cannot take it from a third party is because of that law of the common good. Okay, and get in 48b. Meaning what's going to happen is that you're going to end up not only losing your property, but being involved with somebody else's debt. Do you get how complicated it is? So improvements cannot be collected from sold properties, only from unsold property. Guys, can any of you give it over?
Now, let me give it a shot. I'm a bit whacked out, but I'll give it a try.
Good, mate.
So I'll just give you just more high level. So if sorry, this is how bad I am. Just get me what are we talking about? I do know the answer. Just tell me what we're talking about again.
So the general category is we're talking about properties with liens on them and properties without liens on them.
Yeah. Okay. So if a guy buys a property and he buys it from a thief and he doesn't check that there's a lien on it, then he's pretty then he's pretty stuffed. So now what happens is the original owner can come and claim that land. All right. So and he has to give up that land. Now that third party that purchased that land from the thief can then claim from the thief from any sold property. He can claim up to the value of the principal, and on any property that's unsold, he can claim the principal and the improvements.
Excellent. He can correct. Or just the improvement side, because you might only be able. That's excellent. It's perfectly put. In other words, if there's a guarantee, he can collect only the value of the property from unsold properties. If there's a guarantee, but he can't collect the improvements, even with the guarantee from sold properties, to protect that particular purchaser down the line. But he can collect those improvements if there's a lien on it, if there's any unsold properties left by the robber. That's correct. But if there's no guarantee on it, then he's pretty much high and dry, which is his own fault for not checking it out and not having a guarantee on it. So, Gavin, I thought you did amazingly well.
So, Damon, is this the original owner of the properties that had it stolen by a robber who then sold it to a guy that made improvements? He has all these claims.
No, we're talking about two different claims, as Gavin said. We're talking about when you bought a property and you didn't realize there was debt on it or that it was stolen. So
there was a lien on it, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So I'm saying when you buy that property, you've got to have some sort of guarantee written in it that you've got a claim against the person who sold you that property, because you don't know what financial health that person or moral health that person was into before that sold you the property. Was it stolen? Was it indebted to somebody else, etc.? So what we're saying is now you've spent 200,000 Rand on the property. You can claim that back if there's a purchasing guarantee that you made on the property from both sold properties that the person that sold it to you have sold other properties, not that one necessarily, to other parties. You can basically go back to the person that sold it to you and say to him, I want some of your assets. He says, I don't have. Well, who did you sell your other assets to? Ishploni. Well, I can go and collect from Ishploni because I've got a guarantee on the sale that I can get back my money. That's how it happened to you to start with, by the way. Happened the same way in reverse. But the improvements you made cannot be collected from another buyer whom the person that sold you a defunct property also sold somebody else a defunct property. Why? Because then there's no end of debt that other person could get into. So improvements can only be collected from unsold properties of the seller. But principal can be collected from sold or unsold properties, but improvements only from unsold properties. Gavin, that was perfect.
So, Damon.
It wasn't as
yeah, well done. You explained this very well, okay, very succinctly to Gavin.
Thanks, man.
Thanks.
If the buyer or that guy that buys the property from the robber, he needs to find it. He needs to ensure that there aren't any liens on it. But the robber's not going to tell him. How's he going to know?
So
I will say, of course, they aren't. You know what I mean?
So I'm assuming there's one of two answers. I think it's an excellent question. Is that's exactly why you have a guarantee with him in writing that you've got some sort of claim if somebody comes to collect the property that you bought in good faith. Now that guarantee might not be worth the paper it's written on. So what you can do is down the line figure out that if this guy did you a dirty and sold you a property that was going to be collected, he did it to somebody else. So therefore you can't collect it from the seller because he stiffed you and it was stolen or indebted to somebody else. He's done it before. So you can collect that property from some other poor hapless buyer that happened to be in that situation. But the improvements you made to the property, Kevin, you can only collect it from the original person that sold it to you. You can't make somebody else indebted for more than they bought it for. That you can't do. Okay, so we're going to see how this relates to Rabbi Meir, etc. But you guys have got the principle. I think we can end off on this note.
Can I make a joke about that, Gavin and Arthur? Listen carefully. Yeah. So if somebody buys a piece of land, let's make a joke. It'll actually make us understand it easier. He buys the land from the guy who'd stolen it originally. So the original owner who had it stolen, the illegal owner, the rightful owner, let's say he takes it back. So as the guy that bought it and lost out, he lost the plot.
Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah, there we are. Well done.
No, that is actually very good.
That's actually very nice, good.
No, I think
Arthur, what are you eating? You eating a hamburger there, Arthur?
No, it's a bit. What I think it is, he hasn't lost the plot. Okay, he's the sole the sole thief. I think he might have lost his soul. Sole proprietor.
Yeah.
He might have. Well done.
Arthur, were you in McDonald's? Were you? Or Burger King?
In another, I'm in a egg with my half an hour with fish. Jeez. That's egg and brinjal.
Did you just have you had a cheeseburger, Arthur? I saw. I won't tell anyone, okay?
Yeah, sure. That's the bacon burger. How did you know?
Yeah, no, I saw. I won't tell